Uh, in 2010, in connection with a study for the European Commission, we put together a multidisciplinary team that carried out a systematic review of current knowledge about the factors at play in the perpetration of 14 forms of interpersonal violence. And for each form of violence, we tried to assess what factors influence the probability or the likelihood of becoming a perpetrator. Taking a human rights perspective on gender-based violence and on generational violence means looking at how individual acts of violence are made possible by structures of unequal power and recognition in society. All experts agree that perpetrating violence is a multifactorial phenomenon. That is to say, arising from the interplay of factors. There is not a single root cause. Violence is not a disease, but a set of social practices of power. In surveying the research, we found that there is significant overlap in the circumstances that may lead up to different forms of violence. But even with regard to any one form of violence, as we will see, there are different trajectories. And since the factors involved in one or the other form of violence are interrelated, for a far-sighted preventive strategy, it's essential not to fragment the problem, but to take account of the connections. After reviewing the research, we found that it was indeed possible to cluster the numerous variables that are measured in empirical studies that are often very specialized. By doing this, we could see overarching dimensions and similarities in the most important variables that influence perpetration. And by integrating these under a common conceptual framing, we could identify 23 overarching main factors relevant to the different forms of violence. Our focus here was on factors that might be influenced by policy or practical intervention. So we didn't look at, so we say, genetic causes or anything of that kind. And these factors, the weight and influence for each factor and the interplay between them differ by form of violence, but together they describe a set of common roots of violence resulting from structural inequalities of gender, generation, and sexual orientation. To promote the understanding of what leads up to perpetration and provide a tool for effective prevention, we decided to create an interactive visual model, which I am going to present to you today with screenshots and explanations. In order to assess the salience of these factors for each form of violence, we drew on the sum of research evidence to assess the effect size of a variable or the relative strength of influence as being weak but measurable, moderate, or strong. And you will see this in the screenshots. When there is no consistent research evidence, the factor was treated as not relevant for that form of violence, although this may in fact only point to gaps in the research, of which there are many. The factors are located on 4 levels, different levels in society and culture as a whole, what we call the macro level, through organizations and institutions, which we call the meso level, and larger social environments. In the social worlds of daily interaction, which we labeled the micro level, and in the individual's life history, the ontogenetic level. The purpose of this model was and is to make current research knowledge about conditions that influence perpetration more accessible to policy and practice. We were convinced that visual presentation is grasped in its complexity more easily, whereas essays and papers and sentences tend to suggest that there's one particular thing counts. We aim to capture the complexity of the issues and the different paths that may lead to using violence in a way that lets us imagine intervention and prevention. In 2021, because the software that we used in 2010 for the interactive model has been discontinued, we have reprogrammed it, and we also did a rapid review of more recent research. And you will find this now online as of yesterday. The model condenses the many forms of violence into 9 categories. And the first will be of the most important for us here. The first includes rape and sexual coercion, partner violence and stalking, sexual harassment, trafficking, so-called harmful traditional practices such as forced marriage, child abuse and neglect, child sexual abuse, and child sexual exploitation, and finally, violence based on sexual orientation. Based on the research review, we were then able to show similar and different pathways leading up towards various forms of violence. Our goal then was to stimulate thinking about ways to reduce or prevent violence. An important note that I want to make is that this is not about risk assessment. Risk assessment has been established as an obligation of parties to the Istanbul Convention, but discussion of risk, both in policy and in research and in practical intervention, tends to focus on becoming a victim. That is to say, being in danger of greater, perhaps lethal harm. And indeed, it is, of course, crucially important to assess the needs of a person who is facing violence or harm. But without assessing the person who poses a danger, there may not even be a risk of harm. A brief example of how that can work from where I live, when the police are called to a situation that they see to be one of domestic violence, they are authorized to order the person posing a danger, is what they call it, to leave the residence and stay away for a set period, usually 2 weeks. The police are not asked to make a difficult decision about how much and what kind of harm this person, the victim, this person, the perpetrator then, might do, and if possible, both of the couple will be put in contact with specialized services where they can ask for advice and just try to get an idea of what their options are. By ensuring a period of physical distance and an offer of advice and support, victims are given the power to identify their own needs rather than being classified as a high, medium, or low-risk case. Research on case files of women killed by a partner find that the current models of risk assessment, were not very successful in finding out or predicting who might in the end be killed. Prevention thus needs to focus more clearly on the possible perpetrators and to understand how young people experience and make sense of violence and what that leads to later in life. What supports feelings of entitlement and makes the use of violence seem attractive or justified? Entitlement being having a right to get what one wants, and if necessary, using force or pressure. And what further enables or encourages violence in social networks and environments? for example, through a culture of silence that Michael Kimmel describes, and through non-intervention when something has happened or is happening. Now let us go to the model and look at some of the factors. This is more or less what you see when you open up the model. And we hope it will answer various questions for you. It has 3 parts. The model itself has 3 parts. The first 2, this is the first one, showing the factors involved in perpetration and by choice of one of the forms of violence, or 2 or 3 perhaps. The second will show the factors involved in perpetration from a different point of view, and I will get to that. And the third is a process approach through path models. As an introduction, I am focusing on sexual violence as the example. And the perpetrator model allows you to choose one or more forms of violence. Here, sexual rape or sexual coercion, and see what factors have a weak, moderate, or strong influence, which is represented by the size of the red buttons. This, of course, is just a screenshot. When you have opened the interactive model, you can hover over each button and get the kind of explanation that we have here on the lower right, saying briefly what devaluing women as a factor actually is intended to mean. And we have on the left side of the model also some questions that you might ask. For example, you could ask, isn't impunity the key factor in rape? Because impunity as such doesn't turn up here. Well, it is globally, but in most of in all EU countries and almost all Council of Europe member states, there are explicit laws saying forbidding or sanctioning sexual coercion. The problem leaves on the institutional level, where the laws have to be implemented. And so when you have the model, you can click on these questions and find a brief answer. As you looked at that, you have probably found it no surprise that the macro-social level of society and culture, devaluing women is the strongest influence. There is also good research in evidence that exposure to sexualized violence in the media increases the acceptance for using sexual coercion. Dominance-oriented masculinity in society and in culture has a significant direct influence. It has been often called a rape culture. But it also can support a very strong factor on the individual level of a masculine self, meaning a hostile and defensive masculine self-concept, including approval of violence against women, belief in rape myths, and proving oneself a real man.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to turn the temperature off.
Oh.
I keep getting these calls with someone in a call center offering to do something about my computer. They're very persistent.
We all recognize that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you have them too.
Yeah.
Okay, but as a comparison, in the next screenshot, I'll see the factors that lead to child abuse and neglect on the 4 levels. And there you see, when you look at the top, that the strongest relevant factor is actually children's status, the extent to which the rights of children are not fully recognized, or children are expected to do as adults tell them. And the tendency to see children as a property of the parents is also still rather widespread in many countries, leading to non-intervention, not only by neighbors, but sometimes by social workers who say, well, it's the parents' right. So this gives you some sense of how different patterns turn up depending on your choice of the type of violence concerned. The interactive construction of the model let us look at the levels separately and also to compare patterns for different forms of violence by adding to and subtracting from the picture. You can see in the next slide what happens when you click on both rape and child sexual abuse, because you're curious to know, do they have the same sources? Do they go from the same background? And on the meso level of institutions, it's not the legal framework so much as the failure of sanctions and implementation and entitlement as the two strongest factors that emerge most visibly when you have both rape and child sexual abuse in front of your. So failed sanctions is very relevant because it means that perpetrators can assume that what they are doing will have no negative consequences for them. And this and entitlement, that a man can have a right to believe that he has a right to see that to sex or other services from a woman or a woman who he perceives to be available or to deserve coercion are very key central factors. We located entitlement at the institutional level because entitlement is not just an attitude, it's that too, of course, but also a social institution. This suggests that the site for more energetic policy may be the implementation of laws, not new legislation. Continuing with the theme of comparing factors. If you look at this, the two factors together on the micro level, you can see that while we already saw that there are some factors that are very strong in both kinds of violence, but that at the level of microsocial level, where norms for acceptable or permitted behavior are influenced by peers, families, and social networks, the strongest factors influencing the perpetration of sexual violence are rewards and opportunity. And rewards is more than just the possible satisfaction, sexual satisfaction that the actions may provide the perpetrator, but also there are rewards that can be social recognition, telling the other guys in the back at the club that you did it, or financial gain, or practicing dominance of control, which may be more important than sexual satisfaction. So there's a lot of different possible rewards to this, and they're very important for these two kinds of violence. Sexual violence must promise some satisfaction or gratification to the perpetrator, which is not true of all forms of violence. For example, physical abuse of children can be driven by a desperate inability to cope. Opportunity refers to the ease with which a victim can be intimidated or coerced. For example, a dominant partner will find it easy to take sexual compliance for granted, not even asking whether the partner is willing, as will someone who a child has learned to respect as an authority. So the establishment of a dominance relationship provides a form of opportunity. There are also others. But we can also note that on the micro level of social interaction, a number of additional factors can be involved. That are a definite but moderating, moderating influence, such as stereotypes for rape and sexual coercion and peer approval. If the group that the group of guys think that you ought to be having sex whenever you want, whereas obedience code and family stress are factors that primarily come up in connected to child sexual abuse. So there's similarities and differences. Some words of caution are needed. These are not causal explanations, but a probability model. That is, what makes it more likely that individuals will use certain forms of violence. It is also a confluence model. That it shows how factors can flow together or to make perpetration the likely outcome. And it is a research-based model, and there are significant gaps in the empirical research. We can only model what we know about. The perpetration model, which you were just looking at, allows you to choose one or more forms of violence and see what factors have a weak, moderate, or strong influence. The same information can be looked at from the factor perspective. When designing intervention, this perspective can suggest what forms of violence might be reduced by a change in this factor. So this is a view of the factor model in which entitlement has been turned on to see all the different forms of violence where it plays a part. Depending on where you work, when setting strategic goals, you might focus on the level of policy or intervention and look at the impact of each factor. Knowing as we do that the factors at play enter into different forms of violence, this version of the model allows you to begin at the level at which your area of work or potential intervention is primarily active and think about the possibilities of reducing violence by addressing influence factors. If, for example, you are a teacher and your school and team is seeking to develop a violence prevention program for your school, there is not much point in discussing at length what families may have done wrong in raising their children, although teachers do sometimes like to complain about that. You need to focus on the micro level of practice. And you might ask yourself, how can we ensure that all staff members have the awareness and skills to recognize warning signs of violence affecting or involving a child? And when they are unsure, have easy access to advice. So that would mean that focusing on entitlement, if you're on the meso level, if you're working on the micro level, would be you would ask how it's relevant for you. So depending on where you work, if you're working with individuals and families, interventions to prevent or to overcome traumatic experiences in childhood might be central to what you're doing. If you're working in policy making and policy implementation, or the institutional or meso level, the screenshot shows you that measures to challenge or change prevailing assumptions of entitlement both men's entitlement and that of adults or parents, could have a wide impact in countering most of the interpersonal forms of violence. So with early trauma, you would be working perhaps with individuals and families. It may contribute to later violence behavior, but a hostile and defensive masculine self-concept has a wider impact. There you see how the combination of the two works. So the factor model is able to show you the interplay between different factors for different forms of violence. Focusing at a policy level on entitlement might mean that you focus on establishing policies that communicate within the institution, which could be anything from an industrial concern to a church or an organization in the media or in sports, or indeed a government department, that gender-based infringements of dignity will not be tolerated, establishing clear and reliable access to protection and redress. But that is only, of course, your main concern if you're working at that level. So there's an interaction between where you can actually act and what factors are central. So if you're working with individual and families, you would want to know that prevention and intervention of harmful influences on the level of the history, for example, early support and intervention, enabling parenting practices that allow children to flourish, or provision of therapeutic help for children who have been confronted with violence and had other traumatic experiences. And these could reduce the probability of children growing up to be perpetrators of violence themselves within the family and in intimate relationships. Although, of course, both measures would also be effective in preventing sexual harassment in public places. And I should add that they're also an approach to, regardless of how the child may grow up, it's addressing basic children's rights. While all of the factors from individual life history can contribute to the later use of violence, not everyone who has an unfortunate childhood consumes media violence or has a hostile masculine self-concept perpetrates sexual violence later, or abuse of an intimate partner. Conducive conditions in the social environment are crucial in affecting longer-term effects of negative childhood experiences. Furthermore, with so many possible factors pointing to a disposition towards violence, one would like to know what are the critical points for intervention that might interrupt the progress towards becoming a perpetrator? What are protective factors that a person might, that makes a person less likely to turn to violence, even though some of these factors are present in their lives? So we developed path models, and the dynamic modeling of path models, we were able to develop them for the most widespread forms of violence, and a few combined models to see what the paths look like when two forms of violence may be connected. Dynamic modeling with the path model shows the Zusammenfließen, the confluence of factors across all four levels. Path models thus let us see how factors may interact. They are not a causal chain of determination. If you see a path model, you're not saying, okay, if this happened in childhood, then that's what's going to happen later on. It's the interaction, and because of this, we put into our path models the possibility of both preventive factors and of interventions. And you interactively, you can click on these and see what happens, how the probability of later violence is affected. These models could only be constructed where there is enough research on how individuals become perpetrators. And we found some distinct gaps in this. The extent and quality of research on how perpetration comes about is quite varied depending on the form of violence. It is much more extensive in the area of child abuse, for example, than with regard to sexual violence against women, where the research, every time you think you're getting a research about predicting danger, they're focusing, almost every time they're focusing on women and what they do to get themselves raped, or how it happens that they become vulnerable to rape, and not upon the potential rapist. They're changing a bit. And in terms of child sexual abuse, the research on rape has tended, to the extent that it works on the perpetrators, has tended to use samples recruited in the prison population. Now, as we probably all know, if a man accused of rape has a record of other violent crimes, he is much more likely to be convicted, and if convicted, to receive a prison sentence. So that rapists in the prison population are more similar to other perpetrators of other forms of violent crime. But this is not a realistic picture of what real-world sexual violence looks like. And there is some research on that, but not a great deal. There are a growing number of studies on perpetrators of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, while very little is known about why some men harass women sexually at work or elsewhere, and others don't. Overall, there is more research on violence within the family than in other areas. So there are different forms, and this picture shows you how we depict the different pathways leading up, in this case, to both rape, but partner abuse plays a role there as well. When you open this interactively, you get the paths opening up one after another so that you get a sense of what each one looks like. And to give this in a screenshot, we colored the path different colors. So you have a green and a red and a blue path, just so that you can look at this on the screen and say, oh, I see, that's what that is like. What we found when we draw on our research and on theoretical analyses of the effects of factors was that the routing in different pathways tends to be weighted towards predominant levels of factor impact. And I think you can see this already, where you have one path, where the green path, where a lot of things having influence on the childhood and life history level. You see a red path that looks like it's more societal influences on institutional level, and the blue path where partner abuse leads pretty much directly to rape. And so entitlement leads to abuse for a partner, and then from then on, she has nothing more to say about whether or not she wants sex. One path in this, towards partner violence grows from multiple negative childhood factors, with antisocial behavior developing in adolescence, and aggravated perhaps by alcohol abuse in their friendship groups or the guys they hang out with. A different pathway originates more in societal or macro factors and centers on entitlement, including peer approval of the notion a real man is in control. So here you see for partner violence, the pattern that emerges when negative childhood experiences lead later to an inclination towards perpetration. And it goes by way of adolescent antisocial behavior and peer approval. So you can see that the impact or the probability, the likelihood of negative childhood experiences leading to later intimate partner violence is mediated by the social groups and to some extent adult peer approval, like when the other guys in the pub say she have to make sure she does what you tell her. But if by joining up with other young people who also have a difficult background, and these adolescent antisocial behavior predicts or leads towards later use of violence in an adult situation. Here you have a view that shows how the macro-social and mesosocial evidence, the social society and culture and institutions combine to increase the sense of entitlement and also influence stereotypes, and they move towards distorted cognitions, and the masculinity concept in society and culture supports the notion in childhood that to be a real man, you've got to be in control. And that also goes by way of peer approval into entitlement. If she doesn't do as you say, then you have a right to punish her or force her. That is here the masculine, the Zusammenfließen der masculinity concept in society with the development of a masculine self of hostile masculinity or hypermasculinity, as it's called in the research. It's a very key dynamic aspect for these negative childhood experiences. It harms emotional development, as well as shaping ideas about predatory sexuality as normal. Young people who are already burdened with negative experiences are likely to seek peer approval with others of a similar background, where antisocial behavior and heavy drinking are the norm. The path models for sexual coercion and rape also show the importance of the peer group. So this second path is more strongly influenced by the main factors on the level of society and culture, and shows that how entitlement and failed sanctions grow out of on the meta level, the broader structures of devaluing women and respecting dominant masculinity. Stereotypes play into the distorted conditions such as rape myths or believing that possessive jealousy is a sign of love. Thus, young men can be influenced by their peers to use sexual coercion and to establish and maintain dominance in an intimate relationship On the one hand, they are encouraged to believe themselves entitled to women's subordination, and on the other hand, they feel the need to prove themselves real men to their peers by enforcing it. A third pattern leading up to partner violence can emerge when families are under stress with few resources, with stereotypes feeding into a sense of entitlement. This is what that looks like. But there is also a pattern centered around honor codes, which exists in mainstream cultures and not only among migrant communities. Masculinity notions devaluing women and underpin honor codes, which seems to lead fairly directly towards intimate partner violence and violence towards young girls in particular, or family teenagers in the family. The relevance of adolescents and peer groups has been described very eloquently by Michael Kimmel, who has described how sexual violence becomes normalized for young men growing up, and how they are pressured by their peers to do things like catcalling, making sexually abusive remarks to girls or women walking past them. And that if you talk to these guys, if he talked to these guys alone, he would find that some of them were really very unhappy about doing this. And he suggested, well, why don't you look the next time and see if someone else in your group also feels that way? And then there are two of them, and then they say, we really don't think this is a good thing to do, and can actually lead to change the group norm changing. So it's not that the normality of forms of abusive attitude toward girls and women are deeply seated, but that peer groups tend to hold on to standards that they have developed and enforce them because they have something to do with the group identity. And that someone has to get the idea and the motive and the courage to say, I think maybe we should not be doing this, to actually change it. And that can actually have a dynamic of change. So the path models actually show that where there are already negative childhood experiences, adolescent peer groups that reinforce antisocial behavior are a key mediator. And there are now longitudinal research studies that strongly suggest that it is this pattern, the mediation of the adolescent friendships, and not the experience of violence in childhood, that leads to both partner violence and abuse of one's own children. So experiencing violence in childhood does not necessarily lead to the patterns of doing the same thing when you get to be grown up, but that the peer group experiences in adolescence play a key role, which is very suggestive for what one might do in the way of prevention. Here we see a very simple a partial model for child abuse and neglect, where poor parenting by the parents, or the failure of parents not being able to cope with raising a child, combined with peer approval, and then underlined with stimulus abuse, the use of heavy drinking or drug use or pornography consumption, can lead both to child abuse and neglect and to partner violence. Going back to the model of rape and sexual coercion that I had before, this suggests to you that this shows you that there are both protective factors that we identified and that you can look at on the interactive level, and possible interventions, each of which will then show you what impact this has.
Carol, we're kind of running out of time.
Okay.
It's
That's one of my last. Yeah.
Yeah?
This is just the uses of the model.
Yeah?
As an educational tool, it lets you combine different forms of violence. As a strategic tool, it lets you zoom in on the level of intervention closest to your sphere of action. And as an imaginative exercise, it lets you try out interventions and see how they might interrupt the path leading towards violence.
Wonderful.
The interactive model is now available. I think it's also on the chat now for you.
Yes.
And if you find any bugs, just send me an email.
Good to
Because
know.
we just uploaded it yesterday.
Good to know.
And this is just a very quick look at what the NGO Alliance against to End Violence Against Women in the UK did with our model. They translated it into factors and then the policy implications for the 4 levels.
Fantastic.
And there we also have the
further readings.
Yeah. You can. Yeah. I presume that everyone will have access to these
yes,
links.
Please. Yes,
Thank
please.
you for your attention.